Please welcome Christy.
Thank you. I'd also like to add to that bio, actually, that I was an advisor to Dr. Andrew Bennett, the former ambassador to the Office of Religious Freedoms in Foreign Affairs. And before I begin, I also want to commend, whoops, this went out on me.
It's gone.
Oh, can you hear me now? Okay. Commend Donna. She's a great leader with the ICEJ. You wouldn't find somebody with a greater love for Israel and a force behind it. Now, I'm going to start out by actually discussing the Open Doors reports, which talks about the 10 worst persecuting states against Christians. You'll notice that North Korea is number 1, but there's something to be discussed about North Korea versus the 9 Islamic states that are there. First of all, North Korea, the persecution against Christians is not based on a deep hatred against Christians as such. It's more based on state paranoia. North Korea and their leader, it's based on a monarch where any religion or any force that comes up against Kim Jong-il will be crushed. That's just the nature of that particular, it's an atheistic system, and that's the nature of that particular system. However, now we'll be looking at the 9 Islamic states that are persecuting Christians. A lot of our society today, we cannot comprehend the hatred that Islam has against Christians and Jews, and this is something historic. I want to also say that this is not going to be a talk to turn everybody against Muslims, because not all Muslims are bad. In fact, the fastest growing religion in Egypt today is atheism, because Islam is at a point in history today where the population is not satisfied. They're tired of being crushed themselves by Islamic despots in the Islamic states. So you have a lot of pluralism within Islam itself, but it's often crushed based on the nature and the history of the faith itself, which is based on the immutable decrees of the Quran, the Hadiths, and the Sunnah. So there's an understanding that needs to be to come out here on why these states are so heavily persecuting Christians. If one goes back in history and one looks at even the messages of the Quran, for example, Quran 2:16 says, "Fighting is prescribed for you, and ye dislike it, but it is possible that ye dislike a thing which is good for you." So there's a notion within Islam, and again, not all Muslims follow that, but there are a lot of those, and the Islamic states do it. They're under Sharia law, and they tend to adhere to the Islamic text to one degree or another. There's a general preaching that we hear in Western society that the Islamic State is an aberration, that it does not reflect Islam as it is today. But one need only look at the Islamic states, need only look at the severity of persecution that is taking place, to the point where Civitas, which is a British think tank, Open Doors, and other think tanks and human rights agencies declare that Christianity is being wiped out in the Middle East, the place of its beginning. Something else needs to be taken into consideration, which is quite recent news in Lebanon. Lebanon is actually the most populated Christian area. It was 40%. That's going down rapidly as well, partly because of ISIS, and there's a direct plan by ISIS and Hezbollah to actually decrease the population of Christians in Lebanon and replace them with Palestinians and Syrian Muslims. So even that is decreasing. The population of Christians in Egypt is 10%, but if one looks historically, the most violent and powerful caliphate in history was the Rashidun Caliphate, where Umar al-Khattab, he was the caliph at that time, and very mighty, very powerful, which started in 634. And that is where he rampaged through the Middle East. The population of Egypt with Christians at that time was actually 99.9% Christian. So when one even looks at Egypt today, you look at the Christian Copts, which have an origin way back to the day of Mark, when he went over and traveled to Alexandria. One sees what happened in the state of Egypt. One also notes that the history of the Muslims in Egypt also goes back to Christianity before the Islamic marauders rampaged through the entire Middle East, took it for themselves, and destroyed not only the Christian population, but also Jews that might have been in the area as well. So this hatred that we see, I'd like to give you a little bit of an insight as to how intense that hatred is. Some of you may have heard of a fellow by the name of Dr. Tawfiq Hamid. He's a senior fellow and chair of the study of Islamic radicalization at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies in DC. He's also a former member of Jamaat Islamiyah terrorist group in Egypt, and he worked alongside Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was actually the current head of Al-Qaeda. And here's what this fellow says when it comes to the hatred against Christians and Jews by Islam. First of all, he notes that the way they treat Muslims in China is much worse than you would see in any so-called deemed Christian state or Judeo-Christian state. But that is not the issue, that is not the threat. The threat is Judeo-Christianity, that is the threat. Here's what he says. They won't even, quote, they won't even say Zionist anymore. This is a direct quote because in the book I have many interviews, and I'm actually giving a bit of a sneak peek on what this fellow said with regards to this, because I think it's too, quote, filthy to use on their website. It is, again, quote, continuing to quote, it is a normal Arab mentality to not mention the word Israel or the word Zionist. This implies that they want to erase these people from the map. He goes on to talk about Western values, which he says were completely against Al-Qaeda and against the Islamic states that are ruled by Sharia law, particularly the violent groups that seek to destroy Israel and wipe out Christianity, which we know is a very big problem because that's why we're here today, talking about Christian persecution. He said, in our nation and in Israel, we want to give them freedom. They want to give them freedom. We want to kill the apostates. The West wants freedom of religion. We want to implement corporal punishment. The West is against corporal punishment. We want to see slavery. In fact, there were many books saying slavery is part of Islam and encouraging this. The West stopped the slavery. I and others wanted to remove the West from existence. If we could do it with nuclear bombs, we would do it. If we could do it with viral terrorism, we would do it. That is the kind of a hate that this fellow discussed that was a part and parcel of these groups that seek to wipe out Israel and also destroy and wipe out Christians from the Middle East. This is a statement that the Islamic State released quite recently. Quote, even if you were to stop bombing us, imprisoning us, torturing us, vilifying us, and usurping our lands, we would continue to hate you because our primary reason for hating you will not cease to exist until you embrace Islam. Now, according to the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS and other groups that purport Sharia law, try to advance Sharia law, there are two houses in the world. One is the House of War, Dar al-Harb, and one is the House of Islam. So, the goal is to subjugate the houses of war under the House of Islam. And there are those that say, oh, that's not happening. That's not happening in our country. You bet it's happening, even in our country, let alone the goal to wipe out the Jews and the Christians from the Middle East. That is the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, unfortunately, the kind of hatred in our society that we hear coming from these groups, and again, not all Muslims, it's hard for us to understand because we're based on a society of human rights. We get told things like, look at your colonial history, look at your colonial past, look at your past of slavery, look at all the people that you crushed historically. Well, when one looks historically, every group was crushed at one point or another by some other group. And when we look at what Islam has done historically to people and continue to do today throughout the Middle East, and black slaves are still being held in Mauritania, one wonders, why is it that in our culture we're tolerating the intolerable? And this is a kind of a habituation that we've come accustomed to in our society today. We live in a society where individualism has taken root. One of the most interesting interviews I conducted actually when I did the live daily talk show, it was a book called The Ego Boom, Why the World Really Does Revolve Around You. And it was written by Steve Mach and Leanne George, two authors and two editors from Maclean's magazine. What they were indicating is that the whole marketing system is about you. Everything is about you. And this kind of a narcissism has gripped us, and it started long before the 60s. And while we try to blame the kids today who are entitled and they don't care about their neighbor, many people don't even know who their neighbor's name is, the problem really is that we bought into this system. It's a feel-good system where everything is about how we feel, whether we're happy, whether we're proud. If our kid is a dunce in school, rather than take that child, work with that child, you have to be so careful because you can't interrupt that child's self-esteem or give that child even the slightest feeling that they may be a failure. But when that child grows up and finds that it can't find any employment, can't succeed, can't get into university, can't get into college, can't get anywhere, that child is, who's suffering at that point? Who's suffering? We live in a society where it's based on how good you feel. Yes, we have weaknesses in society, we should be helping one another, we should be caring about one another, but the whole ego boom is based on just that, it's based on us, and it's based on how we feel. It's even permeated the churches, where most preachers preach about health and wealth, and if something's going wrong in your family, if you're poor for legitimate means, maybe you did something wrong, maybe you did something wrong in terms of offending God, maybe you better check yourself, and nobody wants to have anything to do with you. Even if the minister is suffering, the minister doesn't want to tell anybody in the congregation because what did that man do to insult God? What's going on? And if you're not healthy, you're not wealthy, and you're not looking as if, well, you're on cloud nine, on top of the world, you're deemed to be doing something incredibly wrong in your life. So, the topic of Christian persecution is not what churches would consider a sexy topic. It's not welcomed in the churches because I'm telling you, I've been around Christians for a very long time, and yes, on Christian Persecution Day, everybody cares. How many Christians do you see here today? This place we should be sitting on each other's laps. Christian persecution, we're being wiped out in the Middle East, where Christianity began. Yet, there's a lack of caring because of the individualism that's permeated society. Now, everybody could be accused of individualism, so I'm not here to say how awful we are as a society. We are a model of human rights, after all, in our society, because we're not going around killing people and holding slaves. No matter how much the propaganda keeps permeating, that's coming from these of certain Islamist circles, that we're vile people, we come from a colonial past, we're hateful people. They're allowed to come to our country. Muslims are allowed to find jobs just like all of us. Whereas you look at what's going on with the propaganda in the Middle East about Israel being an apartheid state.
Syria, reinforced regime change in most of the Middle East is not attacking people of Islamic faith in the Middle East. It is not violent.
Yes, and I appreciate that, but you will have your time to speak afterward. Yes, it is very bizarre. And this guy couldn't keep quiet anymore, and I think it's wonderful because we should be booming with an antagonism for righteousness in our own hearts when it comes to the persecution of Christians and the persecution of Israel and the Jewish people. We look at what's going on, for example, with Israel. The word Zionism, I quoted what this fellow said about the Zionist entity. The word Zionist is hated. The word Christian Zionist has been adopted. And that is also hated by Islamists. They don't want Christians supporting Muslims. So it behooves them to keep on, for Islamists to keep on saying, look at your history, look at your dirty history, look at how the Palestinians are being treated. And that's another aspect of what I'd like to discuss today when it comes to marketing and when it comes to propaganda. We have also marketed victimhood. This Islamophobia narrative. The fact of the matter is, even on our soil, the two greatest groups that suffer from hate crimes by far are still Jews and blacks. It's a very small number of Muslims that are suffering hate crimes in our country, despite what's going on in the Middle East, despite the attacks that we're seeing in the West. And still, we have this Islamophobia narrative, we have this Palestinian victimhood narrative, when Abbas was the one that said, in a new state of Palestine, not one Jew will exist in a Palestinian state, whereas you've got a lot of Muslims and Palestinians living in Israel. Why are people listening to this? Why are they tolerating this kind of propaganda? But it's a marketing propaganda of victimhood that has seized us to the point where we have a phobia, all right, and it's a fear of Islam. It's not a notion of attacking Muslims, it's a notion of fear of what they will do. I can't tell you how many times I've been told, do you feel safe talking the truth of what's out there? It's not a matter of whether you feel safe, it's a matter of what's happening, it's the truth. You've got people being persecuted out there on both on the Jewish and the Christian end. Yet there is a sad sort of an apathy, because we're so accustomed to hearing about it. We're so accustomed to hearing that the Palestinians are the victims. Well, what about their rights to the land? Well, for goodness sakes, if you go back in history, the Palestinians come from all over the Middle East. Are there not enough Middle East lands? This is precisely the history of what's going on. And Israel is the one getting the blame, as opposed to the real source of problems, which are the Islamists living there, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Iran, all of these groups that are out to wipe out Israel, and wipe out Christianity. Okay, I get it. One more thing I'm going to say that I think is important to indicate. Canon Andrew White, the vicar of Baghdad that Donna mentioned, he said something very important about a very sad partnership that's now taking place between Christians. Some people call it Chrislam, between Christians and Islam. He told British journalist Melanie Phillips that, quote, Palestinian politics and Christian theology have become inextricably intertwined. Melanie Phillips went on to say, too, that a radical Palestinian theological revisionism, which was trying to delegitimize the Jewish state through a reworking of scripture, had revived replacement theology. So there is a war going on, an ideological war going on within Christianity as well, based on Palestinian victimhood. What can we do? Finishing on a positive note, we need to be lobbying our political representatives who don't want to deal with this. Why are more Christians not coming into this country? This is something, when it comes to being a refugee, this is something very critical that we have just rolled over, and we have not held our politicians accountable. We need to speak up, and we need to be fearless in speaking the truth, because we ignore our fellow men and women that are in need. It's going to come in knocking at our door, and we're already in a bad position in the West, as we see unfolding in Europe, as a result of ignoring a force that can no longer be ignored.